Welcome to the Homelab Show, episode 63, Troubleshooting Tips and Tricks. And I'm joined here by Jay. How you doing, Jay?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
Probably a little tired. You've been editing a lot. I know that.
I am. Yeah, I've been editing a lot of content, but it's I'm getting so caught up now that it just feels great. I always complain, "Oh, I'm behind," but you know what? That's not the case now. So it feels great to have content flow. I think by next week I'll totally be back to my normal content schedule.
Awesome. Yeah, we've done 63 episodes. Well, this is our 63rd episode, which means with all the projects and all the things we talked about, we probably should talk about how to troubleshoot some of those things. That's
Yep.
when we were talking about doing it on the earlier podcast episodes, and we're like, no, let's push it back a little further because now we can discuss some of the troubleshooting things, which is gonna be kind of fun. But
hmm
before we jump into this, let's quickly thank our sponsor of this show, and that is Linode. They've been a sponsor for I should probably count, but I think it was only 1 or 2 episodes they didn't sponsor. So pretty much all of the shows, about we'll say 60 episodes or so. And we like to thank them for being a sponsor. And these troubleshooting tips we will cover today will pretty much apply to even things you host in Linode. So if you need one of these projects that we talked about, hosted somewhere on a public IP address, external from you, and there's going to be more videos coming where that'll become applicable as well. Linode is the place to host it, because not everything, or especially if you're behind CGNAT, is easy to host yourself in your home lab, even though, yes, we may consider Linode a extension of your home lab, that public facing thing. Maybe you want people to poke at it. Let them poke at their IP address instead of yours. We have an offer code to get you started with Linode, and we thank them for being a sponsor of the show. Oh, and it's Linode / the Home Lab Show. I should probably make sure I say that.
Yep. And they could be your ultimate DMZ if you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Put it out there. Let their cloud deal with it. All right. What's the first tip on our list? Where do we want to start? Is it the before you buy?
Yeah, I would think so.
All right.
It makes sense to start here. Now, I do concede that this only probably benefits I don't know, 25% or less. I'm not really sure what the percentages are now. A lot of times when people buy equipment for home lab, it's mail order, it's eBay, things like that. You can't touch it until you actually get it. But with things like Facebook Marketplace, I'm not advocating for Facebook, but it exists, and we have to acknowledge that it exists. They have a marketplace, and a lot of people are buying servers there. So it is the case that sometimes you actually can touch what you're about to buy before you buy it. And one of the first things that you can do, because what I've seen is that people just assume everyone else is running Windows, even people that are selling secondhand equipment. They might load Windows, I don't know what version, maybe Windows Server or something. Anyway, if they will allow you to see it running, which, if it's an in-person buy, why not? You really want to see that it works. The first thing you should do is go to the Windows Event Viewer immediately, because if there's actually a serious hardware problem, Windows is going to be complaining. Now, keep in mind, though, that the event viewer likes to complain. So there's never going to be a situation where you'll go to the event viewer and not see some critical errors. Okay, so the presence of critical errors or whatever, Windows just calls everything that. Now you might get lucky and not see any errors, but you probably will. But
There's always something
specifically,
in event
yeah,
log, unless the event log is completely broken.
which is even worse. Or suspicious if it's completely cleared before you arrive. Hmm. But if you
Yeah.
look at it and you see like hardware errors about a device failing, don't buy it. You're gonna have some trouble with that device. So just say no, thank you. And I've done this myself. There were like 2 laptops that I bought for a Linux on old laptop series. I really need to get back to that because it was a lot of fun. But both of them I bought, if I remember correctly, off of Facebook Marketplace, at least one. And I remember, he brought it out, he put it on the back of his trunk and powered it on. And I just went right to the event viewer and I'm like, yeah, I need to see if this thing works. And the only thing suspicious I found is that he put an Apple hard drive because it actually said in the
Oh,
list of hardware devices. But it is an SSD legit, and it's made by name brands. I didn't really care. But anyway, the point is, you could see some hardware errors, and if you do, then don't buy the device. Ignore the driver errors. That doesn't really affect you at all. That just means the person didn't install the driver for something. Um, you'll probably see errors about an unclean shutdown. It happens. But if you, again, hardware errors, you definitely want to check that out. But that's only if you can get physical access to it before you buy it. Like, there's a server store in Ohio. I wish I could remember the name of it, but I've actually driven all the way down there because the guy will just let me, power on whatever before I buy it. He didn't even know I had a YouTube channel, so it wasn't special treatment. Um,
And you can also ask people to send some pictures of it powered on,
yep.
put something in the message so you know the pictures weren't doctored, and I doubt they'll take the time to really Photoshop it, but, like, write today's date on a Post-it note, stick it to the monitor, and take a picture, and
Yeah.
there's little things you can do to try to verify. It is an aggravation because there are scammers out there. That's a lot of why we're mentioning this. Don't blindly buy things. Now, there are reputable places you can buy from. You can, of course, look on eBay and things like that, and I'm not saying eBay is reputable, but you can at least try to make some determinations about the reputation of the particular person. Of note, when you look on eBay, look at the person's selling history. And if
Yep.
they made a fortune and a great rating selling socks, and next thing you know, they're selling servers, someone may have taken over that account and used that reputation to convince you that they were a great place to buy from. So just
Yeah.
do a little bit of due diligence on the buying part when you're building out your home lab. It's one of those little things that's, you get excited. You're like, that's a great deal. And it has 128 gigs of RAM. And then maybe it's not.
Another thing to check too, if what you're buying is a physical server, and if you can get pictures of this, even better. I kind of feel like they need to take pictures of this. Like, look at the capacitors. Because if it's a server, you could just easily open up the case and look at it. You want to make sure none of the capacitors are bulging or leaking, especially not leaking, but if they're bulging, they're about to leak.
Yeah, but I
So,
will admit that's a
mhm.
little bit less of a problem now because most things have the better capacitors now. But years ago, that was a huge problem. It's not, the problem hasn't gone away completely. The good news is it's just less of an issue here in 2022.
But I
But
think
worth
that
noting.
even is more to my point, though, because a lot of the equipment that circulates when it comes to home lab is the older stuff before they fixed it. And there was a certain Dell Power Edge, I wish I could remember the model number, where this was so common, and I remember going online, and there was, like, somebody who was literally making money by, say, "Hey, send it to me, and I'll redo the capacitors for you," and he made a business out of it at the time
Yeah,
because of how many there were, and those models are going to circulate. Yeah, you're right, it's less of a problem now, and especially if you're buying, like, a laptop. I mean, if you start trying to open up a laptop in front of somebody, they're not gonna let you do that, that's going way too far. So of course, everything I'm saying is situation specific. But then the next thing though is what you should do before you put it into production. So you have this device and everything checked out for you and it's time to get it going. Now, this is the hardest thing for me because when I buy any device, I want to get it going right now. I don't want to wait. It's like a kid in a candy store. I want to just dive in and start munching on it. Don't
yeah,
munch on your servers, right? But I just want to get going on it. But it is better to spend some time and do some more troubleshooting because it's possible you could have like memory errors. You can run mem test on it. You should run mem test on anything before you put it into production. Unfortunately, that does take a long time, but it's a lot less time than building the server,
and
finding out
having
it
it
doesn't
crash a
work.
lot.
And you can't even trust the data at this point because you don't know what data went through bad RAM and what's corrupted. I mean, that's a way worse situation. Just spend the time, be patient, run mem test, and also run SpinRite on level 2. I'll talk more about SpinRite later, but I would even say if you have a brand new hard drive, run SpinRite on it. The problem is, um, you're pretty much looking at overnight at this point, at least. But if you could spare that time, SpinRite is going to just totally. Even new drives are going to have some issues that the drive's firmware may not find, and that's what SpinRite does.
Yeah,
But yeah, I still recommend you do that anyway, regardless, because it just makes sense to make sure the hardware is actually good before you start relying on it. That's very important.
absolutely.
So the other thing I want to mention, because Tom has something he wants to get out of the way. So I will mention this next because it's extremely important. And I'm the biggest hypocrite in the world for even mentioning this because I'm an offender here. Okay. I constantly don't do this, no matter how many times Tom tells me to do this. So I'm trying to remember. Check the physical layer first. Now we're getting back to the capacitors and all that, but I won't
Yeah,
mention that. Um, you'd be surprised how many times it's a bad cable, or something to that effect. I once had a whole roll of network cable that I bought, and I was making my own cables, and it's not hard to make cables. I thought I was just really bad at it, but it turns out that entire roll of cable was bad. I mean, it was bad, no matter who made the cable. So check the physical layer first, especially if you're dealing with Wi-Fi issues. What are your walls made of? That's a very big thing there. Check the physical layer again, capacitors, but
Yeah,
cables,
and the other
whatever.
thing too is just checking all the loose plugs and things like that.
Yep.
We've had clients that make the assumption a switch is bad, and a whole leg of a building went down, and there's 6 buildings, and they're all fibered together, and they're in panic. Someone cut our fiber and everything else. I'm like, did you check the SFP modules? Well, no. I said, they're a client that we know, and we're like, there's a box of them last time I was in your office because you had spares just in case. And there's a pause, and he goes, I'm
Yep.
gonna go try that. Just emailed me back like 20 minutes later. Hey, that fixed it. It was oddly one of their SFPs went bad, but they thought someone cut the fiber and things like that. It started looking at then they went to is the switch bad? Do we need to start reprogramming it because we can get to these switches? People started jumping all over the place on it. And sometimes it is something just really simple. And it's
Yep.
rare that those things happen, that a cable goes bad or a port goes bad, but it's not the number of times it's happened over the years is not zero. So you kind of methodically just go through especially the easy things to check, you know,
Yes.
that it
Yep.
makes it a lot faster to go through just each easy section as you go and kind of work your way up there. But the checking the physical layer on a lot of that loose plugs, loose fittings, loose connections, those are all really just they're more common than the more advanced problems you think you have with it. I went in Even myself, I went into a little bit of panic when something happened at the office, and then it took me a second. I'm like, oh, that's right. Check the physical right here. It was something as absolutely simple as I should have just looked at. Somehow a plug had come out, and I thought a server had just died, but it just somehow I don't know how a plug came out. It was just a demo server, but I was like, my
It
demo's
happens.
broken.
It absolutely happens. I mean, sometimes it's obvious. I remember my first IT job ever, I was doing help desk in a factory. So I worked in the office part and I would just walk out into the factory, which, I got a lot of steps in and I ruined a lot of shoes. So I got a lot of exercise. But I'd go out to the factory floor and address an issue, one of which was this person complaining that his network connection is constantly bad and intermittent. And when I go in there, I see the network cable lying across the floor, and he has a roller chair. So of course he's backing up over the darn cable repeatedly. And I'm like, did you ever maybe think that you shouldn't like have your chair running over the cable, and maybe we kind of should consider like not having the cable across the floor? Now that's obvious, but often it's really not that obvious. You just have to kind of look at it. I've troubleshooted things for like 4 hours, sometimes months, like my Wi-Fi issue from a couple of years ago, Tom. I was complaining about it for a couple of months, and I tried every setting in Unify known to man, and come to find out it was just a bad cable going to the access point
Yeah,
after all that. So, yeah, check the physical layer first.
absolutely. All right, now the physical layers out of the way, the one
Yep.
I'll get out of the way that I just wanted to throw out there. We didn't A lot of these tools we're going to talk about next are going to be a lot of Linux command line troubleshooting tools. I'll have one PF Sense one in there, but Windows has sysinternal utilities. It's a long list. I don't know if there's going to be an episode on sysinternals, but there's enough documentation out there from Microsoft on it. It's kind of the de facto set of tools you're going to use inside of Windows to troubleshoot a lot of detailed Windows problems. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that or any time on that other than to mention, generally you're going to use the sysinternal tools, and there we go. That's
Yep. I would go as far as to say that if you do use Windows servers in your home lab, I mean, I know enough about Windows to know get sysinternals. Like I know every Windows admin I've ever talked to, they all say, how great those tools are, sing their praises.
yeah.
So if you run Windows, make sure you also have those tools downloaded as well. So that way they're ready for you whenever and if you ever need them.
Before we jump to the next one, Jay, let's talk about one real quick here, because I seen someone mention in here, and we should have been on our list because
Right.
it's always DNS,
It is always
right?
DNS. Yep. Every single
Dig is
time.
your friend when it comes to DNS. I have a whole video on using Dig to help troubleshoot DNS issues. It's, finding mail server problems, whether or not you have MX records, A records, and all those types. I don't know if that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it right now because maybe that's a episode of how DNS works. I don't know if we've
Right.
ever covered that, but that might be just its own episode because all the different trickiness
Yeah.
to DNS. But I have a video on DNS. Dig is your friend. NS lookup. Is NS lookup deprecated in Linux, or
Well, I
everyone
don't know, because deprecated in Linux generally means you
is
really
supported
should
for the next
stop
10 years?
using that. Everybody uses it for like what, 10 to 15 years after everyone tells you not to, and then finally it goes away, if it even does, because it's weird.
I've been
Um,
using Dig for so long,
yeah.
I never think about NSLookup. I think it's still installed by default. I don't know,
I
but
use
Dig is my
both.
go-to tool for all of my things. It's just easy to use. Dig at the IP address of the DNS server, and then the commands after. But it's just invaluable because you want to know how each server responds. And
Yep.
bug us enough and send us some messages and tag us in Twitter, and we'll do a whole episode on DNS because we can. I'll dive into my zone transfer story that got goofed up one time. So
So here's the thing. I'll make a deal with you, Tom. I will absolutely be on board with an episode on DNS, just as long as we call the episode "It's Always DNS." That must be the title, and
it's
then I'll
always
agree to it.
DNS.
That
Yeah,
has to be the title. Then I'm on board.
yeah. But we'll mention DNS definitely on the list. All right, now you have a good one in here. Or rescuezilla. I
Yeah, there's
mentioned
a
it.
few tools in here, and I'm going to mention a couple of them. And by the way, I know we're going to get comments like, "Why didn't you mention X? Why didn't you mention Y?" Trust me, like I know, like there's a bunch out there. But rescuezilla I like because it's compatible with Clonezilla if you do take images, which is great. We had an episode about that. But rescuezilla supports those images plus a bunch of other tools. So your general troubleshooting tools and apps and things, it's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of uh, bootable tools. So it's one of the things that I recommend that you have flashed to a USB, or Tom turned me on to Ventoy recently, which is a lot easier. I haven't tried it with Ventoy, but I assume unless the knowledge base says otherwise, you can use it with that. Either way, at the very least, have a flash drive with rescuezilla on it, because if you need to do any data recovery, anything like that, it's a good one to have. But I also mentioned Xubuntu as well, which is going to be strange at first, but there's a reason. So I didn't mention Ubuntu or Pop! OS because, well, first of all, the thing is I'm talking about live bootable Linux distributions where you can run it off a USB, which is pretty much the majority of distros nowadays. Um, what I like about Xubuntu is that it has the same, it's built on Ubuntu, so it has the same compatibility, but GNOME doesn't really work well on GPU starved devices. And let's face it, unless you have a very specific kind of server, you probably don't have a GPU, because a lot of the server hardware, it has GPU enough to show something on the display, and that's it. Like,
Yeah,
it's not built for games. Unless you put a GPU in one, it's probably going to have the weakest video card you can get. So you probably won't be running GNOME on that. So Xubuntu is lightweight. It has the XFCE desktop environment. And I know there's lighter weight ones, but I feel like Xubuntu has like some of the best functionality with being lightweight, so it'll run well on whatever server. And you can use that for file recovery. So, for example, you want to get all the files off a server, you could just connect it to the network, boot from Xubuntu, rsync everything to somewhere else, verify the data, then you can sell it or whatever it is you want to do. And another thing is that it has boot repair that you could download from the repositories. And even though it's live, you can still install software until RAM gets full, obviously. But you can
and G
install the
parted.
boot. What's that?
And G parted.
Oh yeah, Gparted Live is another one. But yeah, Xubuntu for file recovery and boot repair for sure. It's just a good thing to have. I mean, you could even use it to Google the problem you're having with the
Yes.
server on the server. I mean, let that noodle around in your mind for a minute. But yeah, gparted live is great.
Well,
There's
no, you can
what?
actually load gparted in the Xubuntu as well. Is what I was
You
saying.
can, right,
Yeah,
you can, and, for some reason, I've always had gparted live separate. I don't even know why I
which is
do that.
nice, and that
Maybe it's
works too.
redundant.
Gparted separate is nice if you want to use it. It's just a live CD you can download that boots right up in gparted. It's nice because it's really lightweight and dedicated task. But if you're troubleshooting things and you find that troubleshooting leads you to partition problems, then you can apt-get install gparted along with Googling those two problems right on the rescue one, which is kind of
Yep.
fun. Like Jay said, it's let that noodle around a little bit. You can boot up, do all your diagnostics, have internet, do everything on there, solve the problem. And the other advantage of using something like Xubuntu is, like he said, arch syncing files, but we'll go a step further. You have all those facilities in there for SMB mount and everything else to be able to mount other things without having to load a lot of that. That kind of just comes default loaded in the Xubuntu to
Yep.
get things moving. So it's a great way to rescue servers and things like that, that you don't know why that last command caused the problems that did or what happened, but it's a good way to help unravel that.
Now, another thing that I'll mention about this that's probably even more important is that live media help us determine, like, is it a hardware issue or a software issue? Because if the problem follows whatever distro you boot, then it's probably hardware. I mean, obviously it varies, but if you try to reproduce your problem in live mode, you'll learn a lot about the situation that you're dealing with, especially if everything works fine in live mode. And another trick you can do with live media that I don't think a lot of people know this, you can, for example, boot from, let's say, Xubuntu, and then get another flash drive and put that in another slot. And then you go to install Xubuntu, but be careful, don't install it on your actual server. Point it to the other flash drive, and
Yeah.
it'll treat that flash drive as a legit hard disk. And then what that flash drive then becomes is a actual install of Linux that is not in live mode. It's actually booting, it's writable, it's every bit a real Linux installation on the flash media, and you don't have to deal with the try or install or any of that other stuff. It's already installed. It's installed on the flash drive. So at that point, you have a legitimate hard drive. Yeah, it could be a little bit slower, but you can install or build whatever software it is that you had running on the internal disk and see if that works. And then you can take that flash drive out with your software and settings on it, put it in another server, and see if it works better there. Because if it does, then there might be something specific to the original server.
Yes, absolutely. And what's next on our list here?
So there's going to be a lot of smaller things to mention. One of which, and I have a video coming out that goes over logging, but tail the syslog. I mean,
Yes.
it's like the ultimate thing when you are troubleshooting anything, just tail -f syslog or varlog messages, regardless of your, I mean, depending what distro you have, that you can watch the messages scroll as you're trying to reproduce the problem. And it's the number one way that I troubleshoot SSH because SSH, and
Yes.
people complain about this because they're like, well, I can't connect to the server via SSH. It's not even giving me an error message or anything that really tells me why. I mean, it could tell you why, but I mean, SSH will tell you that your password is wrong when your password was not the issue and it was the key. I mean, there's just all kinds of oddities there. So I think the issue is that SSH doesn't want to give you too much information about why you can't connect, because if it's a bad guy, then they're getting information about why their attempt isn't working. So it's a good thing that it's not giving that info. But on the other end, you could, like in a web console window, just tail the log, try to SSH from your terminal, and in the logs, especially varlog secure or the auth log in Debian will give you information about SSH. But for everything that's not SSH or security related, just tailing the syslog or varlog messages will absolutely give you some information that'll help you understand exactly what kind of problem you might be running into. So you could check dmessage as well. That's a kernel ring buffer. There might be some information in there as well. Um, Another thing that's not as known, because this is a problem that doesn't happen often, but I think Homelab people would be more likely to run into this than the average user. I'm talking about inodes. This is not something that people really think about first
Oh,
because I've
yeah.
seen.
That's an interesting one too,
Mhm.
because this was a topic I just brought up when I was talking about the new way XCP and G backs up, and I'm glad they added the warning on there because they're doing data chunking into lots of small files to make merging deltas faster. But that chunking of putting it all in a bunch of small files, they warn you if you're not using ZFS or Btrfs, don't do this. If you hit an ext4, it only takes X amount of data to completely overrun all of that. So you're just going to have a real problem.
For sure. And I remember very early in my career how frustrated I was when I ran into this. So here's what the symptoms look like. You have an error that the disk is full. You go to write a file and it says insufficient free space or something like that. And then you do what everybody does, df-h, and you look at it, and I looked at it, and I'm like, it's 20% full. It's literally got 80% of its space free. So it's not full. What's going on here? And then after a ridiculous amount of researching, I stumbled upon this. I'm like, oh, so if I type df-I instead of -h, I'll see how many inodes are in use, and then the maximum number of inodes that can be used. And like you're saying, it takes a ginormous number of files to fill up the inodes. This is not something you'll run into unless something is really wrong. Like if you have a mail server, which is probably the big problem, you shouldn't be running your own mail server. But if you are, and you have like a bunch of like error messages like Nagios would be sending out that are constantly queuing up and duplicating over and over and over again, then that could cause it. It's probably more likely to happen in a company though, honestly. Yeah. Anyway, df-I, if you have a
Yeah.
situation where the disk is reporting that it's full, but you look at it and it's not actually full, at least not in the sense that you would think of it as being full.
Yeah. And I'll also mention, I almost just out of muscle memory habit, I'm going to type DFIH. And the reason why is I just want human readable on the sizes. It just makes it a little bit easier to show you on the space side of it, a human readable format. So you understand it easier. Because at glance, if you don't see just how many digits that is when you deal with larger storage places, you're like, oh yeah. And it's easier to see, oh, that's a G in front of there. We have that many gigs free of
Right.
space on there. And just a touch back on the log files, there's a great utility that's free. It's built into most repositories called LNAV.
Mhm.
And LNAV is great. So LNAV will allow you to do color-coded real time, plus has regex matching of any of the logs you put into it. And you can even take and put multiple logs together into one LNAV view. So if you wanted to watch two log files simultaneously in real time, you can type LNAV in the two different log files, and it will consolidate the view on there. I've done a whole video on it. It's just a really impressive tool for being able to not just see the logs or search the logs, but also watch them in real time as something's happening. It's an invaluable troubleshooting tool for sure when you have log problems to go through.
And another thing I'll mention about logging, this is thanks to Michael in the chat room, because I can't believe I forgot. Actually, I can believe it because I started using Linux way before systemd was even thought of. So I'm still not like conditioned to think of it like doing everything the systemd way, but it is the way it's going. And no, I'm not trying to start a flame war, believe me. But journal ctl -f is follow, so you could follow a log file, which is great. But you could also use the -u option to follow a specific unit. So if you wanted to follow SSH, then you could use -u and then SSH. And what's easy to remember, because I've said, when nobody's around, I mean, come on, we've probably all done this. We're trying to get something to work and we get agitated. We're like, F you, we get upset. So, excuse me, journal ctl-fu. It's so easy to
Yes.
remember. And then the unit name after. I mean, obviously you could do -uf, right? But it's not as fun. So if you do -fu and then the unit name like SSHD or whatever it is, you'll follow that specific unit's messages and you won't see messages that are meant for a different service. So that could help you narrow that down. So it could be like on Ubuntu, journal ctl-fu Apache 2 or HTTPD if you're on CentOS and so on. So that's the systemd equivalent of the tail-f.
Yeah. And I'll give a shout out to Cat Daddy for Duff, DUF. That is prettier than that. I'd actually not used it before. I knew because it wasn't installed on my system. I just installed it really quick. It was in the repository, but Duff is a more enhanced, prettier version. I know I've seen it before at some point. I didn't know what people were using when they showed that. So it's a really nice kind of ncurses drawn version of the du command. So that's clever.
When it comes to
One
those
more to
disk
add to the
utilities,
list.
oh, I'm sorry. I was going to mention when it comes to all like these disk utilities for free space related shenanigans. The interesting thing here, you have to install them before it becomes a problem, because if your
Yes.
hard disk is completely full, then you're not going to be able to install Duff
Yep.
because it's full. So obviously your inability to install Duff answers your question. Yes, the hard drive is full.
Yeah.
Problem solved, right? But
It may
to
not
be
give you the error
fair,
message you expect, though.
but considering what you, Tom, have added to the list, which I'm going to let you own this one, that's another one that you'll want to install before it becomes a problem, because then you can't install it if you have no space to install it in. But it'll help you with your free space.
Yes. ncdu. And there are utilities that are graphical, like UI graphical. This one actually has some graphics to it. I
Yep.
actually was just using this today because I had to solve some Elasticsearch problems where one particular index was too big, but I want to delete stuff from the command line. So using this in the command line, it can analyze all the directories and then tell you how much data is in each one of them. And when you have, well, I don't know, 600 of them in a server that's storing a bunch of Elastic data, and you just want to purge one particular index because something broke and that's the fastest way to fix it. It can help quickly find the offending folder that had 400 extra gigs of data for no reason in it when most of the other ones have a gig of data. So it's a really nice utility for searching down and figuring out what's taking up all the space on a, per folder basis, per directory basis, however you want to call it, and drill down into it. It also trees down as you go into each of these. It is just a really simple utility, but boy, is it handy. I've actually used it. I had a weird Docker problem where the Docker didn't delete a bunch of stuff that didn't show up in Docker, but I did use it and I found all the extra files that the database, when something had failed, had an extra replicated copy on it. It wasn't in use by anything, but it was definitely using up space.
That could happen.
Yeah, so it's sometimes those utilities, but it's just really handy sorting out space problems of Linux. We've spent a lot of time on that, but you also, in real life, you spend some time on sorting out storage issues. So
Yeah, it is. It's storage in DNS and number of contenders, with DNS being number one, obviously, because we can't. Even the entire internet can break sometimes. It happens.
yeah,
Another thing to address here is this kind of a weird problem to work through. You have an issue on your server and you want to troubleshoot it and try a few things, but you're also kind of scared of making the problem worse, like breaking it more and then it becoming more, harder and harder to figure out how to fix it because, you just made it worse. Um, One thing to keep in mind is that if you have your server running in a VM, clone it or take a snapshot, depending on the data. If you had 100 gigs of data or way more, it's going to take a lot longer to clone, obviously. But if you clone a VM, and I'll do this on Linode and Proxmox both, I could just, use all of my troubleshooting against that clone. And I don't care if I break it, I'll delete that clone and create another clone until I get it down to a science about what exactly fixed the problem. And I know exactly what to do on the production instance. Now, of course, you could take a snapshot all the
yeah,
same. That'll serve the same purpose. It doesn't have to be a full clone. But, some companies out there will even do full clones just to, put in some, backup testing as well. So it kind of gives you an opportunity to test your backups. If you grab a backup that was taken, after the problem started and you restore the VM, your backups are at least working because you're able to restore it and the data is there. But if it has a problem, then you can just troubleshoot it. And I think it is kind of liberating to have this feeling like I could do whatever I want to this server. It's not my main thing. I could break it and that's fine. And then you just have no hesitation and you might actually be able to fix the problem sooner because you have a contingency plan, just as long as you're not a bonehead like I've done sometime. And then you're actually on the production server because the PS1 prompt is exactly the same on both. Okay, you got to be careful, right? But with a clone of your VM, if you're troubleshooting, you can absolutely get it down to a science as far as what caused your issue and what you need to do to the real one to fix it.
yeah. And I have a lot of snapshots that are frequently named before Tom did a thing.
Yeah, me
Because
too.
Yeah,
Yep.
I just hurry up and
Yep.
snapshot something, run the command, see if the outcome is what I had hoped or not what I had hoped. And if it is, great, I'll eventually delete my point in time that was before Tom did the thing. Yeah, that's really handy. It's one of the reasons, virtualization is so popular. It isn't just because it makes a lot of things easier or more efficient use of your hardware, but it also allows you to grab those points in time where you can say this point in time was exactly, before I did this command that I think will work. I think it will fix my elastic indexes. Ooh, that didn't fix them at all. That seems to have caused a completely new problem. So
Yeah,
revert back.
it's funny you mentioned that because I'll do like a snapshot that's base install, updates installed, kind of down different layers. I have so many snapshots that if a VMware admin looked at it, they would just get red hot mad and there'd be steam coming out of their ears. You need to get rid of those snapshots. I've heard that over and over again from VMware people. But snapshots are a very useful tool and I use them without hesitation.
Yeah.
But also the majority of my YouTube videos are actually the result of a VM. I record from real hardware, but before I hit the record button, I rehearsed on a virtual machine and I had snapshots to know or to test what's required and what's not. Because I see a lot of how-tos out there that'll say you need to do these 10 things, and I do like 6 of those things, or check the documentation from the project and it doesn't even have those things in there. So then I just keep trying over and over again until I get it down to a science, and then I record it on real hardware because I know it's going to work. So yeah, I mean I take snapshots way too much, I think, but it works.
Yeah. Next couple utilities, and we're going to get into the networking side of things now. And I really like it's just simple, but it gives you real time stats from the command line. And yes, you can do this with a couple of utilities we'll get to, but bmon is really simple, bmon. And it monitors your network, gives you a cool little graph to show you how much data is going across, but it can also give you the bytes, collision, errors, broadcast deliveries, fragmentation problems, a lot of little details about your TCP/IP stack. And when you're doing a bunch of goofy little troubleshooting with networking, it's kind of helpful to be able to see that. Next one on that list is going to be, and I seen Netstat, and someone said the replacement is SS. Yes, use both. SS or
Yeah.
Netstat, both are solid, and you want to see what connections are going somewhere and what connections are going back and forth to things. Those are great for having snapshots. There's a lot of scripts that probably have a lot of that integrated in there, especially with a lot of Netstat, because you need to know what is or is not connected. But let's go a step further and let's watch that in real time, filtering for connections even. iptraf-ng. iptraf-ng is awesome. It lets you in real time with a completely, because you can SSH into a server and do this. By the way, when you do that, also when you create the filter, you can create inverted filters like, please ignore the SSH connection I have going into this, and then start looking for the connections you have in there. iptraf-ng is just really helpful. Let's say you want to see if a certain server has a TCP connection to a certain IP address, or maybe even just certain ports, what's connecting on this particular port that I have a service running on. And I wanted to update on the screen in real time and have a nice little, it's all just driven through keyboard commands or up down arrows to go through menus, kind of an ncurses look, but it makes it really nice to just go through those menus and go, all right, I can see this, or I can see what's hitting the ports. And easy example, maybe you're setting up a Unify server and you want to understand what services are coming connecting to one particular port on there, then you can start doing that and make a list of those IP addresses. This is just some really, those handful of utilities are just kind of a combination of things I use a lot to kind of burn through and understand the TCP connections going on and what's going on with them. I'll also give a shout out because bmon does a nice job, but if you just want to watch speed, there's iftop, and that's interface top. It's kind of like top, but for the interface. So we'll show you how much bandwidth per IP. And then there's also speedometer, which will give you a speed rating for that network interface and kind of has a cool graph to it. And all this is a command line. So these are all just really helpful when you want to watch some of the data going across.
And Netstat is a great idea. One of those things that is technically being deprecated, but in Linux it takes a very, very long time. So I think your advice will probably be good for another 10 years. I'll never understand why getting rid of legacy things is so hard. In companies, I get it because I know what the challenges are, but I still reach for Netstat, and I haven't made the SS command muscle memory yet. No matter how many times I see articles out there telling me I shouldn't use Netstat, it's just install the NetTools package and it's there. So, I mean, as long as they make the package available to me and it's installable, I know technically as an educator, I should be telling people to not use deprecated things. But honestly, in my opinion, the warnings are out there, and they usually have the warnings out there a very long time in advance. So if someone all of a sudden can't install it anymore and they're not ready, you know what? It's on them because they should have paid attention to that warning. But while it's in the repository, it's muscle memory. It's really hard to break. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that it is. Now,
yep.
there's plenty of other networks too. I see people talk about more of them, but we'll move on to using Iperf. I
Hmm.
suggest this all the time, and it's going to be kind of related to another question someone asked about MTU. When you're doing some of these troubleshooting things, Iperf is a great way to load up interfaces, and this works in Windows and works in Linux and works in FreeBSD. There's compilation. I think there's an Android. I don't know if there's an iPhone, but there's even an Android app for it. Um,
Wow.
iPerf is great. It's even built into pfSense. The overall with iPerf is you set up one server to listen and the other server to broadcast, and then you can test the line speed. Because before people start diving into, I can't figure out why I can't get these file transfers between my NAS and my computer going. I always ask, and I rarely see anyone start with I tried iPerf and I'm getting a full connection between these two devices, and I'm not getting the speed I want on my NAS. It always starts with my NAS is only transferring at X. I have a 10 gig connection, but it's not even getting to 1 gig. I'm like, what's iPerf say? And there's always like a 24-hour response in my forum post before, oh, I did test iPerf and I had it plugged into the wrong port because I couldn't get above a gig. I'm like, okay, now we know the problem. iPerf is just
Yeah.
such a handy utility for understanding whether or not you have solid connectivity. It does not write any files, so you are not limited by the file system in it. It is doing just a raw network socket, basically, to go from point A to point B and see how fast we can get there. And if you can't get there at full speed, you have a problem. Kind of related to the MTU problem. When you think about the way MTUs, in the way you're doing the chunks, if the switch has a misalignment, so to speak, you set a 9,000 MTU, but then your switch actually requires you to set a 9,000 plus a few extra bytes for the header. And that can cause a problem because you've got some extra VLANs in there. And so it's offsetting it. You'll run into an iPerf problem right away when you start connecting devices and realize something's dropping some of the packets. And you now have less packets going. So there's lots of retry transmissions going across this
Hmm.
line, and retry transmissions take up bandwidth. Therefore, you do not get the full bandwidth. iPerf just makes a lot of that troubleshooting and tuning really easy to do when you're doing it. It's like the common question I ask all the time is, did you run iPerf? Because I
Yep.
do a lot of NAS troubleshooting, a lot of VM troubleshooting. iPerf is even built into XCP-ng. I believe it's probably natively defaulted or easy enough to install on Proxmox. It's also in TrueNAS. So it's already
Hmm.
on the platforms you use. And then to go a step further, you can load it up on your phone, because the next question is, how fast is the Wi-Fi? Well, it depends where you're standing, and iPerf can kind of make it pretty easy because you can have a fixed number. You know how fast iPerf is, and you keep moving between fixed points and seeing how fast the data traverses at full speed across the access points. So iPerf is it's an easy, free utility, been around forever, works on all the platforms, and I just find it really, really handy for doing all the network speed troubleshooting.
You know what? It's funny. I Before I discovered iPerf, which I wish I knew about it before I did, my go-to was like having the larger version of the CentOS ISO downloaded, the DVD, and I would just send it from one computer on the LAN to the other and just kind of do a verbose mode and just watch how fast it goes, which is not an accurate way to do it. But before iPerf, that was totally my go-to, is just send a big CentOS image across the network and see how fast it gets there. But don't do that. Use iPerf. Don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not iPerf is just makes life simple. Now,
Right.
to go a step further, this is a little bit more in depth, but definitely worth if you want to play with lots of tuning things. And I've used this plenty of times in my videos, and that's Phoronix. Phoronix Test Suite is amazing. If you want a test suite where you can have it all graphed and mapped out for you, so you don't have to open up your own spreadsheets to do this. Phoronix just has an amazing set of utilities. It's used by the industry as a whole. You'll see other not just YouTube channels, but lots of people serve the home, and all those people, whenever they do tests, they'll run the Phoronix lab test.
Mhm.
And it's just great because you have a repeatable, absolute consistent. You can even script it. You can go further, and it has a web interface if you want to get complicated into it. But just using the command line Phoronix, you download the suite, load it up on a server, run the commands, document, make notes, I should say, of just which commands you ran. So you run it consistently. They have a test suite that'll test for everything from processor, memory. They have SQL simulators, Apache simulators. So you can simulate the entire type of workload. And this is used commercially, I know, by a lot of companies before they build servers, because they kind of determine, what is this server going to be set for? Oh, this is going to be your, SQL server. All right, let's go ahead and simulate a SQL server on this. Then you run the command set on there. It creates an output. Then for each time you run it, it'll ask you, would you like to upload these results? You just keep saying yes. And for each run you do, you can make notes of what you changed. Change this configuration. So you're running the same test. The important part is you're creating a consistent baseline of tests. And then for each note you made of your change, for example, I did my iSCSI versus NFS. Nothing different. The command output was the same. The only thing different was the VM was stored on an iSCSI target for one and an NFS target for another, and I ran each one of those sequences of tests. And this is how I get those different performance numbers. But having that consistency you get from something like Phoronix allows you to tune, because you can't really tune without a consistent baseline test that you run perfectly the same. You can't just say it feels faster now, because that's the kind of fuzzy way of doing it. You want something that's extremely objective. And that's why if you see me, and I thought about maybe I'll do a video on it, because I don't think anyone has, of how Phoronix works. But it's free, it's open source,
Mhm.
it's easy to get access to, and it is a wrapper in some ways for a lot of other utilities, because it uses under the hood FIO and a few other things. It even has a kernel compile benchmark, but if I'm not mistaken, it actually loads GCC and compiles to make it work. So
Yep. So just to address a comment in the chat room, because I feel like a lot of people are going to have this same question, is PHORNONIX.
yes,
Because when you
for
hear
Onyx, no
someone
PH.
saying it, yeah, it
Yep.
doesn't sound like it, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I've used it too. It's really good.
Now,
Um,
it
yep,
does share the name with the news site for Onyx, and yes, they're the same people that produce it, because they do a lot of Linux testing, and they built this utility to have a consistent baseline for their reviews. So
yep,
it is also Phoronix News is not coincidentally named. It is, the test
yep.
suite is named after and maintained by them. They do a lot of testing there, and of course, this is also really cool. The results database is public. By default, people make it public, but you can then look at something maybe the Phoronix news site tested, and then you can compare your benchmarks to theirs. And that's one of the things it'll give you is stats on that, so you can see how you're doing to get baseline averages. Especially, drive performances. Very tricky to do with a lot of setups, and Phoronix, trying to say, all right, is it as fast as this array or that array when you're testing things? It's really, it gives you some really good numbers. So
Mhm.
definitely, it's an involved utility. If there's enough people message me or DM me on Twitter or something and say, Tom, can you make a video about it? Because it seems kind of hard, because their documentation is sparse. But it's not, if you play around, you just kind of figure it out. If you're familiar with running command line stuff, and once you kind of get the nuances of it, you're like, oh, and they do have forums and support as well. So,
Wanted to take a quick moment and mention more about SpinRite, because I meant to
oh
mention
yeah,
that at the same time I was talking about Ubuntu and rescuezilla, that it was another one to keep on hand. Now, what SpinRite is a way of triggering the error correction on the drive to do the job that it's supposed to do anyway. Because let's be honest, we're not. The fact that SpinRite exists is great because it's useful, but it shouldn't exist, because this is the job of the hard drive to be doing the error correction, but the error correction of the disk firmware is just not that great. So what SpinRite does is, if there's a bad sector, and all hard drives have bad sectors, and then in SSDs we have bad cells, it if you have a situation where you can't read data from a drive, what SpinRite tries to do is it tries brute force almost to read the sector over and over and over and over again. It's like a 3-year-old that's asking the same question over and over again. It's asking the hard drive for that data over and over again, and the hard drive is answering, I can't read this. I can't read this. The hard drive is supposed to say, a long time ago, there's an error with this sector. Let's map it to a good sector, but it doesn't do that as good as it should. So SpinRite is just a way to force the drive's firmware to do what it's supposed to do. And the situation that it helps in is, of course, file recovery, but it also kind of helps with, I think they call it disk rot, where you have things are slower to load, but they do load. It's just over time, because there's some wear. It actually forces the data to get mapped to a better area, and it can actually make a slow install actually feel fast again, and all you did was run SpinRite on it. So I just make sure to on physical hardware. You don't need to run this on VMs. That'd be crazy. Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do
But you
that.
can run it on the hypervisor, on the actual physical hardware. You could run it on SSDs at level 2. I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly, level 2 is what you want because some of the modes will take weeks. I mean, that's when you have data like it's you need that data and you didn't have good backups and you don't mind spending having this thing run for weeks to have like a 5% chance that it might read the data and you get that data back. But just running it every year on your physical hardware makes sense. And also, if you run it on brand new hardware, that might also help as well. So I wanted to, it's not free, by the way. I want to throw that out there. Um, it's not free. It is slow. There's a faster version coming out. It's been in development for like 10 years. It'll come out one day, promise. Well, actually, it's not for me to promise. It's made by Steve Gibson of GRC. He's one of the two hosts of Security Now, one of my favorite podcasts. But I've used SpinRite a lot, and I like it. And it's saved some. It's actually done a lot of good. So it's just one of those things I like to have around. I'm not saying to go buy it because what if you don't need it? But if you run it every year, I think it will actually add value. So it's just, even though it's not free, it's something to consider.
Yeah,
If you're a
it's a
Linux
neat
person,
utility.
oh,
Steve
go ahead.
Gibson's put a lot of work into it. His new
Oh yeah,
version's a lot faster, so
yeah. His new version isn't out unless it is, but
I
I'm
think
pretty
you
sure
can
it's
get the beta if you
not.
buy it, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. Well, I'm still
I
waiting for the final release,
Yeah, I'm waiting for the final release, so
but it's one of those things that really shouldn't help, right? Because again, hard drive firmware should be doing this stuff and it shouldn't be an issue. But unfortunately, SpinRite exists because the hard drives themselves just don't do a good job with this kind of thing. So that's why I wanted to recommend that.
Yeah, no, that's and it's worth mentioning that because it's one of those things, and I guess I'll mention this too because it's kinda related to SpinRite, is Test Disk. I don't know if you've ever used it. It's a
Hmm.
command line file recovery, utility. It's it's one of those challenges sometimes where people lose things, and Test Disk has some ability to try to do it. SpinRite try to recover it. Just back everything up. I know we're saying that, but everyone's like, "Well, cool. I wish I would have heard that before I lost my data." But
Right.
recovering data is always really, really tricky. So I'll throw that out there. And SpinRite can sometimes save a hard drive, provided it hasn't gone too far.
Exactly. If your BIOS can't read the disk, then SpinRite cannot help you in that situation.
Yeah,
So
it does
you
not recover from
mentioned
catastrophic failures.
right, if it catches on fire, it's not gonna help.
Nope.
Now, test disk, was that the one that people use for, like, when SD cards
Yes.
start getting corrupted?
It's actually I've over the years, it's been a minute since I've used it, but we used to have a lot of photography companies and, um, I mean, I would suggest they don't do this, but they would constantly reuse and they'd buy the cheapest, flashcards they could, whatever they could find on sale, and then they would lose a wedding, and it was just shame, and I'm like, I my opinion is if you're spending that kind of money in a wedding, just buy a dedicated $30 SanDisk, like, you can buy one for 30 or $40, they're just not that expensive, but nonetheless, if you buy the cheapest one and you reuse it many times, there are a limit, and with nice high-res, high-quality cameras, you're writing a lot to these,
Right.
so you occasionally would lose them, and sometimes it would lose the file table. The good news is tools like Test Disk do a simple thing where they walk the disk and identify file types and reassemble based on the file information that can be reassembled. It does pretty much consistently lose the metadata about the file, such as its name. But when it comes to photos, for example, that's not as relevant. You just want to find all the photos and then you can organize and rename them as
Yeah.
you see fit, like so and so's wedding. so um,
Exactly, yeah, and I
it,
feel like
it's
you
an
can
okay utility. It's not like the most amazing, but hey, it's something. And sometimes you can get some files back with it.
and considering how many people within our audience are using Raspberry Pis, I think that recommendation might go a lot further than we might think. Because I know we have some photography people in our audience. I'm one myself, but Yeah, I mean, Raspberry Pis. I mean, it's probably more of a question of who doesn't have a Raspberry Pi in our audience, and the people that don't are probably the ones that are unable to find them because of COVID prices right now, that
Yeah.
would have one otherwise. So that could actually go pretty far for that
Yep.
recommendation. Yep.
All right. I think we've reached the end of our utilities list.
Mm-hmm. Sure have.
Plenty of stuff for people to try, plenty of stuff for people to troubleshoot. It's best to be familiar with these tools before you need them. So play around with them. iptraf
Mhm.
is just kind of fun because you may discover something on your network you didn't know was communicating. Uh, the recovery utilities, maybe not, but Phoronix, boy, it's fun to benchmark things. It's kind of I played with that a lot, and so some of these are just kind of fun because tuning and troubleshooting and figuring out the changes you made and if something was better. So get out there, play with all these utilities we mentioned. They're a lot of fun. I'm actually going to this time put them into the show notes. So they'll be into the description, which will follow over to the show notes. So we will have those in there for those of you that didn't hear some of the commands or just want to copy and paste the commands and have fun with them. So thanks everyone for listening. Looking forward to seeing everyone next time.
Thank you.